So here we have an alternative to some of the ethical theories that we've talked about so far. The problem with some of the ethical theories that people find and that we've kind of mentioned is that they don't really capture the way we normally live our lives. For example, one of the problems with utilitarianism, as we said, is that it makes it very difficult to have friends because you're supposed to look out for the greatest happiness of the greatest number and you're not allowed to privilege your friends. Some of these problems also occur with Kant, with Kantianism, because you have to follow your duty no matter what, even though sometimes that might go against the way we would normally act. And not necessarily in a bad way, like we think that our actions where we're privileging our friends aren't always bad. So virtue ethics, part of the reason why this is an attractive theory is that it can take some of these things into account. And it probably started before Aristotle, because most of these things did, but we often start with Aristotle and Plato when we're talking about virtue ethics. And Aristotle begins with this idea of telos, which is the end or the sort of purpose, I guess, of human beings, but the idea is that what would make us the best kind of people that we should be. So the idea is that there's a best way for humans to be. That's kind of what telos is supposed to be. And so virtue ethics considers what we do, but it focuses really on the kind of person that we should be. And if we're the right kind of person, then we'll know what to do. So James Rachel's, I think it is, or maybe it's Russell, it doesn't matter, sets it out this way. You have to have these parts of virtue theory to really understand what it is. So you need an explanation of what a virtue is, which turns out to be a very difficult thing to do. A list of character traits, which character traits are virtues, that's a bit easier, and we'll talk about that in a minute. An explanation of what these character traits or virtues consist in. An explanation of why these qualities are good for a person to have. And then the last question is whether the virtues are the same for all people or if they vary for different people and cultures. And the last question, Aristotle tends to think is no, but some other philosophers think that they might be different depending on the person. So Plato compares virtue to knowing the way to a certain place. In a sense, it's a knowing how, so knowing how to get somewhere, not knowing that. So knowing that is like, I know that being a good person means helping out children. But that's the way we've thought about morality kind of up to this point in this class. But Plato thinks of it as more of a knowing how, like you know how to sew, or you know how to cook, you know how to be a good person. So to think about it that way kind of changes things. It becomes less of knowing what propositions are true and more about knowing how to do something. So he doesn't think, though, that virtue is a lucky guess, and a dialogue the Meno that we talked about earlier, he kind of waffles around what virtue ends up being and never really gives a definition of it. He kind of ends up saying that it's divinely given. The idea that we can be a good person might be, or how we're a good person, or knowing how to be a good person might just be something that the gods sort of bestow upon us. So he kind of gives up in a way. Aristotle tries a little harder. He stresses that virtue is a hexis, and that's sometimes translated as habit, but it might mean something more like getting ready or being ready or holding yourself ready, and this is preparing ourselves to act in a certain way. So virtue is about being ready to do the right thing. And what that readiness means is not entirely clear, but in any case, it then manifests itself in how we act. So it's about what kind of person we are, but also how we act. So again, in the Meno, Plato has this character Socrates set out to define what virtue is and never quite really does that. He ends up being sidetracked by the question of how you can attain virtue, and Aristotle isn't that much clearer about it either. And he ends up characterizing right actions as something called kalon, which is translated as beautiful and somehow the end or perfection of virtue, which sounds a bit like Plato and the forms. The idea that there's a perfection or there's a form of the good that we can strive for. It's a bit easier to list what virtues are than it is to actually define them. So Plato and Aristotle talk about honesty, integrity, courage, and justice. And Plato points out that one of the things that makes virtues different from other skills is that skills can be used for evil, but virtues can only be used for good. That seems like kind of a ad hoc definition, but Aristotle really pushes this point and says that, okay, really virtue is about knowing the correct middle path between two extremes. So when you think about going into battle, standing to the side and not participating is one extreme, and thoughtlessly charging into battle with no plan is the other extreme. So to him, courage is the middle of these two. And sort of having a plan, knowing what to fight for, knowing how you're going to do it, is what virtue is. And for Plato, fighting for an unworthy cause wouldn't be courage, because virtues can only be used for good. So he's kind of maybe making a circular definition of there. So again, the reason why people find this attractive, and it kind of came back into fashion in the 1800s through the early 20th century, is because it seems to be closer to the way we actually live our lives, and it seems to account for personal relationships. Obviously, a virtuous person is going to have friends. If you're going to have friends, you've got to perhaps privilege your friends in some situations, or at least care for your friends. So the idea that we have different moral obligations to family and friends than strangers seems to be something we all accept, and virtue theory can account for that, whereas some of the other theories cannot. So Aristotle also argues that there are sort of holistic reasons to be a good person. A virtuous person is going to do better in life. Somebody who has loyalty, courage, and all these virtues is going to have a better relationship with others and more success. Self-control, which is one of his favorite virtues, kind of goes to that middle way sort of thing, helps us be healthier and better at achieving our long-term goals. So he thinks that virtue is good for action, but also just part of a good life. And Plato is similar on that. So again, for both Plato and Aristotle, they think that virtues are the same for everybody. Since we're all humans, we all have the same sort of end. There's some kind of good that's good for everybody. And this is one of the problems that some people have with virtue theory, is the idea that there is one good for everybody, or there's some virtues that are good for everybody. And Nietzsche especially did not think that. He thought the idea that there's one good for all people is not reflective of the way things really are. And we will start talking about this kind of view on our next chapter. We're not quite done with this chapter yet, but the existentialists really went against this idea of virtue theory, and this, especially the idea of telos, and that there's one good for all humans, and that there's sort of a human nature that underlies the reason for that goodness. So we'll see that coming up in the next chapter.